She froze when the returned quilt reached the counter. Then he understood why. Clara Hale reached the market counter before the church bell finished its second morning strike, carrying 2 folded spring quilts across both arms because the first buyers had begun arriving earlier each week since winter ended, and no one now passed her work table without stopping. One woman already stood at the counter with coins separated in her palm for a pale green quilt stitched the day before, while another waited beside her holding flour cloth and asking whether the next order could be ready before the valley roads dried fully. Clara had just lowered the wrapped parcel meant for morning collection when a third hand entered from the side and pushed another bundle back across the worn counter boards before anyone spoke. The returned parcel stopped against her wrist because it had been tied exactly the way she tied her own deliveries. Same folded corners, same cord knot, same careful weight balanced flat so the stitching beneath would not pull. And for one brief second, she did not move at all. The woman counting payment left her coins untouched. The second buyer withdrew her hand from her own parcel without lifting it. Even the storekeeper looked once at Clara before pretending to rearrange folded cloth that needed no rearranging. The returned quilt still carried the address strip she had written herself 2 days earlier, but the card beneath one tied corner had been folded twice and tucked under the cord, as if whoever returned it had decided not to remove it fully after all. Clara's fingers reached the card and stopped before unfolding it because something smaller had already unsettled her. The wrapping cloth was not hers. The outer layer beneath the cord had been changed, and along one edge ran a narrow silver vine stitch she had not seen in years, sewn too evenly to belong to ordinary trade cloth and too deliberate to arrive by accident around any parcel coming back from a buyer who merely changed her mind. Ethan Mercer had entered carrying feed sacks from the rear door moments earlier, and set them down when he saw Clara stop reading before the card even opened. He crossed without asking, lifted one sack aside to clear space near the counter, and his eyes dropped once to the cloth edge she still held between 2 fingers. Clara finally unfolded the card enough to see the sender line, then folded it closed again so quickly that even the buyers nearest her could not read the name. But Ethan saw the exact moment her breathing changed because the unfinished spring quilt lying beside the counter was quietly pulled away from the light and folded before noon for the first time since winter had broken. No one reached for payment while the unopened parcel remained there, and Ethan understood before Clara spoke that whatever name sat inside that folded card had reached the counter before the quilt ever truly returned. She did not reopen the folded card after the first glance, yet she did not push the parcel aside either, and that hesitation changed the rhythm of the whole counter because buyers who usually spoke over one another now lowered their voices and waited as if the unopened quilt itself had become part of whatever answer she had not given. Ethan drew the returned bundle slightly nearer the window, where the pale spring light fell clearer across the cloth, not touching the card, but studying the outer wrapping she had noticed first. The silver vine stitch along one edge was too precise for ordinary reuse cloth, narrow loops turning in identical intervals with no wasted thread, the kind of finishing done by houses that treated fabric as display before use. Clara's hand rested once over that stitched edge, then withdrew as though touching it longer might pull more memory forward than she wanted in front of the room. One of the waiting women finally lifted her own parcel and asked quietly whether she should return later, but Clara answered only by setting the returned quilt flat and loosening the cord enough to expose the sender mark beneath the fold. The original buyer's name still stood at the top in her own writing, but below it another smaller household mark had been pressed beside the return note, a mark Ethan recognized only because valley merchants sometimes stamped goods that crossed through lower routes before reaching final buyers. Clara saw him notice it and folded the cloth again before anyone else leaned closer. The unfinished spring quilt she had pulled aside remained untouched beside her elbow, though a needle still threaded where morning work had stopped, and that alone unsettled Ethan more than the returned parcel, because she had never left stitching unfinished once market began. A second buyer asked whether the Lower Valley order for tomorrow still stood, and this time Clara answered immediately that it would leave today instead. Her voice carried no explanation, only decision, but the answer moved through the room fast enough that the women nearest the counter exchanged one glance and began collecting their parcels without further questions. The storekeeper counted the delayed coins at last, though even he kept looking once toward the folded card as if names might still matter after being hidden. Ethan lifted the feed sack again and carried it aside. But before turning fully, he saw Clara slide the unfinished spring quilt into cloth without checking the road clock, which told him more clearly than any spoken reason that whatever waited below the valley now mattered before noon had fully passed. When she reached for the returned parcel again, she did not place it with the sold quilts. She kept it nearest her own side of the counter and said only that one delivery could not wait until tomorrow, because if another buyer heard the wrong story first, spring orders might begin changing before the road even dried. Clara left the market before the noon light settled fully across the main street, carrying the Lower Valley quilt wrapped tighter than usual, while the returned parcel stayed beneath the wagon seat, where no passing eye would keep finding it. Ethan brought the wagon around without asking whether she still wanted company, because the moment she chose to leave immediately after market, he understood this road had become larger than one delivery. The town behind them remained busy with spring trade, yet Clara did not look back once after climbing onto the bench, and even before the wheels cleared the last packed mud near the church, she had already adjusted the quilt beside her so its corners would stay clear if the road dipped suddenly. The lower ridge still held damp frost in shadowed places where winter had not fully released the earth, and thaw water crossed the first mile in thin streams that forced the horses slower than usual, but Clara watched none of that. Her attention kept moving farther ahead, toward turns still hidden behind timber, where the valley road narrowed before dropping south. Ethan noticed it by the second bend. Each time the wagon approached a blind rise, her hand tightened once against the bench edge before the road revealed itself, not from fear of rough travel, but from memory arriving half a moment before sight. When the first fork appeared between cedar growth, she spoke for the first time since leaving town and told him the left track held softer ground under the thaw because wagons cut deeper there after winter. Ethan followed the right without asking how long it had been since she last rode below the ridge, because the answer already sat in the certainty of how she watched distance. A mile later she named the timber crossing before they could see water through the trees, saying only that the bridge boards sounded different after thaw if weight reached the center too fast. That made Ethan look at her properly, because nothing on the road yet showed the crossing was near. The wagon continued through low timber where branches still dripped from morning melt, and the lower air changed first, the colder smell of running water rising before the creek itself appeared. By the time the crossing came into view, Clara had already shifted the quilt farther inward, as though protecting it from something she expected before either horse touched the first plank. The bridge looked sound from a distance, weathered but level. Yet Ethan slowed immediately because one support beam below the near side carried darker watermarks than the rest, and before he spoke, Clara said quietly that the middle boards always held weaker after long thaw if the lower beam loosened first. The wagon rolled forward anyway because there was no wider turn before the creek narrowed, and halfway onto the timber, the left wheel gave one sudden drop sharp enough to tilt the entire load toward the running water below. The wagon dropped so sharply that the left horse jerked sideways before Ethan pulled the reins hard enough to steady both animals, and for one suspended second, the front wheel hung between two bridge planks, while the rear axle leaned toward the creek with enough force to drag the delivery crate against the side rail. Clara caught the quilt first, not because it was nearest, but because the crate had already begun sliding toward the gap, where thaw water moved dark and fast below the broken beam. One board beneath the wheel had cracked through the center and fallen at an angle, leaving the rim trapped against exposed timber while water struck the lower supports hard enough to shake the bridge in short, repeated knocks. Ethan climbed down without wasting movement, boots landing on wet planks that shifted under his weight, but then crouched beside the trapped wheel to test whether the beam beneath still held enough to lift against. It did not. The lower support had loosened farther than it appeared from the road, and each pressure against the wheel made the broken plank dip deeper toward the creek. Clara stayed seated only long enough to pass the crate toward the safer side of the wagon before climbing down herself, keeping the spring quilt wrapped beneath one arm while the returned parcel remained under the bench where no water had reached yet. The creek below ran higher than normal for early thaw, carrying branches and old bark through the narrowed channel fast enough that anything dropped there would vanish before catching downstream. But Ethan checked the rear wheel next, and understood immediately that forcing the horses forward would split more timber before the front rim came free. The bridge could not be crossed until weight shifted, and one side lifted by hand. Clara stepped back along the plank edge without argument, and held the horse nearest her by the bridle, while Ethan unloaded what could be carried safely. First the crate, then feed rope, then the smaller tools tied beneath the bench. By the time the wagon sat lighter, cold had begun rising harder from the water than the afternoon light suggested, and the nearest repair timber stood too far back in the trees to reach before dark, without leaving the wagon half-supported overnight. Ethan tested the beam once more and managed only enough lift to free half the rim before the plank snapped lower again. So Clara watched the failing support, then turned toward the tree line where old cut branches lay near the bank, and said the wheel would hold until morning if weight stayed off the front side completely. He looked at the sky then, because cloud had thickened faster than expected, and evening cold would settle early over running water. The valley road beyond the bridge still waited less than 2 miles ahead, but the delivery could no longer reach it before dark, and the current spring quilt, still dry only because Clara had caught it in time, now rested on the safest plank while daylight thinned around the broken crossing. By the time Ethan pulled enough loose timber from the bank to brace the front axle for the night, the sun had already slipped behind the western trees and left the crossing in that early gray cold that always arrived faster above running water than on open road. The horses were tied farther back where the ground stayed level. The crate had been moved to dry earth, and the spring quilt lay wrapped beneath Clara's coat on the higher side of the bridge, because damp air from the creek had begun settling into everything left exposed. There was no shelter near enough to reach before dark without abandoning the wagon, so Ethan used 2 intact planks from the roadside stack to widen one stable section near the bank, giving them enough space to sit clear of the broken beam while he checked the trapped wheel one last time before stopping. Clara had spoken little since the bridge dropped, but now that movement slowed and the light weakened, silence changed shape around them because there was nothing left to lift until morning. She sat near the outer rail where the cold from the creek reached first and kept both hands around the folded cloth, not warming herself so much as holding something steady that still belonged to the day before the road shifted. Ethan gave her the dry blanket kept beneath the wagon seat without comment, then remained near the axle with one knee against the timber, studying how much lift dawn might allow once frost tightened the wood again. It was Clara who finally broke the silence, not because the crossing required explanation, but because the parcel beneath the wagon seat had followed them farther than she intended. She said the silver vine stitch on the wrapping cloth had belonged to one valley household where she once worked before winter brought her north, a place where stitching was measured more carefully than speech, and where finished cloth passed through many hands, but never belonged to the one who made it. She did not describe cruelty in dramatic words. Instead, she said usefulness. There lasted only while silence remained easy, and when she stopped agreeing to certain expectations, her work stopped carrying her own name before it left the room. Ethan listened without interrupting. one hand still resting against the wheel rim, because the way she said it made clear that leaving had not happened suddenly, but had required enough quiet decisions that even now she preferred plain facts over bitterness. As the creak kept striking the lower supports below them, each impact spaced like another unfinished sentence. Clara added only that the returned quilt had never surprised her because some houses remembered skill more sharply than kindness, especially when skill appeared again somewhere they no longer controlled. Ethan looked once toward the parcel still hidden under the wagon seat, and understood then that the name folded inside the card mattered less than the house behind it. Night settled fully before either moved again, and when he checked the wheel one last time in the fading light, he saw frost beginning already along the plank edge, which meant morning might free what evening had refused. Morning came colder than the night had promised, with frost tightening every exposed plank enough that the broken beam no longer shifted under the same pressure that had defeated Ethan the evening before. He was already at the wheel before full light reached the creek, testing the rim while the horses stamped against the cold farther back on the road, and Clara had the spring quilt wrapped high against the dry side rail before the first attempt began, because nothing now could be allowed to fall after surviving the night above water. The frost helped exactly where he expected. The loosened beam held long enough for one lifted plank to stay firm beneath the axle, and with Clara steadying the front side from the rail, the wheel rose half an inch, then another, here before slipping free of the split timber with a sharp scrape that echoed off the creek bank. The wagon settled upright again, but before Ethan could pull it clear, hoofbeats sounded from the valley side, and a single rider approached slowly enough to stop when he saw the blocked crossing. It was an older delivery man from the lower route, carrying empty grain sacks and watching the repair without offering help until his eyes dropped to the wrapped parcel beside Clara. He noticed the silver vine edge immediately and looked once toward her face as if deciding whether recognition belonged there too, then said only that certain houses below still returned goods faster than they ordered them when old workmanship appeared unexpectedly. Clara answered nothing. Ethan tightened the last rope across the crate and asked instead how far the lower road stayed clear after thaw, but the rider's glance lingered once more on the cloth before he moved on, and that silence confirmed more than any explanation from the night before had needed to say. Once the wagon crossed safely, the valley road opened wider, but Clara's voice returned only after the rider disappeared beyond the timber. She said one refusal from a known house often traveled farther than 10 finished quilts because people trusted rejection more quickly than praise, especially in spring when buyers measured what to risk before committing money early in the season. Ethan looked at the parcel beneath the bench and understood then why she had folded unfinished work the moment that bundle touched the counter. Not because one quilt returned, but because one household could make others hesitate without speaking directly. The valley buyer still waited, and delay now mattered more because market talk had already begun behind them. By the time the first lower fields appeared through the trees, Clara no longer watched the road with the same guarded focus as before. She looked once instead at the spring quilt still dry beside her, and said quietly that some places rejected work only because accepting it would admit the hand they once dismissed had become visible elsewhere. Ethan did not answer, but when the road forked near the first delivery lane, he guided the wagon away from the direct buyer stop Clara expected and took the left road instead. Clara noticed the turn immediately because the left road climbed slightly before dropping toward the valley houses, while the buyer, waiting for the spring quilt, lived farther right beyond the grain sheds. Yet Ethan did not explain the change, and kept the horses moving at the same measured pace as if this route had already been decided before the fork appeared. The lane narrowed between two stone boundaries, where old runoff had cut shallow lines through the thawing ground, and after several quiet minutes the road opened beside a smaller side house used by traveling buyers during contract weeks, a place where quilts were often checked before being carried farther into larger households. Ethan brought the wagon to a stop there, lifted the spring order first, and handed it over before Clara could ask why this stop came first. On making sure the delivery was seen and accepted openly by the woman who kept records for several Valley homes. Payment was counted immediately, without hesitation, and that mattered more than the coins themselves, because acceptance happened in plain sight before any rumor from the returned parcel could travel farther through the lower route. Only after the quilt changed hands did he take the returned bundle from beneath the bench and leave it temporarily on the side table near the doorway, not as another delivery, but as something deliberately visible where cloth from many houses passed each morning. Clara understood then that he had chosen the one place where refusal and acceptance could stand side by side without explanation. They returned to the wagon with less urgency than before, or the Valley Road now losing some of the weight it had carried since market, and for the first time since morning Ethan spoke of something that did not belong to the parcel at all. He said the north wall of his workroom had remained unfinished longer than winter. Alone explained, because after his younger brother died, the section meant for 2 hands had stopped feeling necessary enough to complete. He said it without looking at her, adjusting the reins once as if the words belonged to road distance more than memory. But Clara understood immediately why he had noticed unfinished cloth on the counter before asking any question, and why he had never pushed her to explain what the returned parcel meant before she chose to speak. Loss, she realized, had shaped his silence long before the Valley household touched hers again. Where the road climbed back toward the ridge more slowly because thaw mud deepened under afternoon sun, and neither said much after that. Yet the silence had altered. Not empty now, but carrying something named enough to stay between them without strain. When the ridge house came into view near evening, Ethan unloaded the crate first, then stood beside the north wall before entering, measuring one empty section with his eyes longer than usual before taking the spring tools inside. The next morning began earlier than usual because Valley Talk often traveled overnight faster than wagons did, and Ethan left before the stove fully warmed, carrying the returned quilt folded beneath one arm, while Clara remained at the work table with fresh thread laid out but no needle yet moving. He did not say where he was taking it, only that one stop had to happen before town gathered enough voices to shape its own version of what had happened at the counter. By the time Clara reached market later with the smaller orders, he had already returned, and the first sign that his errand mattered appeared not in words, but in the way the woman who had hesitated the day before now waited beside the counter again with payment ready before asking whether her own quilt would still be finished by Friday. The returned parcel was no longer with him. It had been left at the upper trade house near the Ridge Road, the one place where finished work from several routes often rested before being reassigned or collected, visible enough that anyone asking about it would also see which quilts still moved normally despite one refusal. Clara understood the choice at once. He had placed the rejected piece where acceptance still surrounded it, so the returned cloth no longer stood alone as proof of doubt. The storekeeper, who usually watched buyers more than makers, counted the morning payments faster than usual and mentioned that one Valley woman had already asked whether Clara still had space for another spring order after thaw fully settled. That sentence mattered because it meant the refusal had not become the story Ethan feared it might become. But Clara opened fresh cloth on the counter and resumed stitching before noon. But this time her hands moved more steadily than they had the day before, because the unfinished spring quilt no longer sat folded aside as interruption. Near midday, the buyer who had paused longest when the returned parcel first appeared came back carrying better thread than before, and asked for a stronger edge because her daughter wanted the next quilt to last through another winter. Ethan, unloading feed sacks again through the rear door, heard that request and said nothing. Yet when he crossed behind the counter to stack grain, he placed one measuring board beside Clara's work area without being asked, widening the available surface by just enough to stop the cloth corners from hanging. The gesture was small, practical, or almost invisible to anyone else in the room, but Clara noticed because it matched the way he had looked at the north wall the night before. By evening, when market thinned and the road quieted, she returned uphill, expecting only the ordinary light at the Ridge House, yet found the workroom window open and one empty section above the north table cleared completely of old tools. The north room looked different before Clara crossed its threshold because Ethan had moved more than tools. He had cleared the upper wall entirely, shifted the storage chest nearer the window, and set the measuring board permanently against the widened work table, so cloth no longer needed folding twice before cutting. Evening light reached farther across the boards, now that the window latch had been repaired and left open, carrying enough late spring air inside to lift the loose thread ends near her hand. Clara set down the new order cloth first, then unfolded the returned quilt fully for the first time since market, without waiting for him to leave the room. Nothing inside explained the refusal, because nothing had been altered. The corners remained exact, the seam weight balanced evenly. And the center pattern held the same clean discipline that had brought buyers to the counter all spring. Even the card, reopened at last, said little beyond formal return language and the household mark she already knew. The quilt had come back not because of fault, but because the hand behind it had been recognized before the parcel was opened. Ethan was outside splitting kindling beside the wall when she carried the quilt to the work table, and when he came in he looked only once at it spread beneath the window before setting down a narrow shelf board he had cut that afternoon. He measured above the table without asking where anything should go, testing height by eye, as though the place had been waiting longer than the wood itself. Clara watched him position the board, but noticing he left the right side unattached, even after marking both brackets. It was deliberate. Space held unfinished on purpose, not forgotten like before. She asked nothing because his earlier words on the valley road had already explained enough. Some parts remained open until there was reason to close them properly. Outside, the horses settled near the fence while the ridge cooled, and inside the room no longer carried the old separation between his tools and her work. The returned quilt stayed open until dusk without being tied again, and for the first time, it did not feel like something still deciding where it belonged. Ethan fastened only one bracket before stepping back, leaving the other side of the shelf resting loose above the table. When Clara moved the folded quilt aside to protect it from sawdust, but he did not take it away or suggest storage. Instead, he shifted the measuring board farther left, creating room beneath the unfinished shelf where another order already waited. By the time darkness reached the window, the room held fresh cloth, unfinished wood, and the returned quilt side by side without any of them prepared for departure. And that quiet arrangement stayed unchanged long after the stove had gone low. The next morning began before full light, because spring buyers had learned to arrive early when road weather stayed clear, and Clara was already threading her needle when the first knock sounded at the lower door. A woman from the south lane stood outside, carrying fresh cloth folded under both arms, asking whether another quilt could be finished before planting week because her daughter had seen the one collected yesterday and wanted the same steady corners before summer travel began. The order was placed without hesitation, without mention of the returned parcel, and that mattered more than the cloth itself because the market had chosen continuity instead of caution. Ethan took the cloth inside while Clara cleared space at the widened table, and when he crossed the north room, he brought the unfinished shelf board with him, as if the timing had already been decided. He fixed the second bracket without measuring again, secured the board level above the work table, then reached for the returned quilt before she folded it away. Instead of tying it for storage, he placed it across the new shelf, where morning light touched the center stitching first, leaving the edges visible as though it had always belonged above the table rather than inside a parcel. Clara looked once at the quilt, then at the remaining empty section beside it, understanding immediately that the shelf had been cut wider than one piece required. Fresh cloth opened below, thread arranged beside the board, and for the first time she began stitching before checking whether anyone else might still arrive from town. That outside, the ridge carried the ordinary sounds of spring work, fence wire settling, distant hoof movement, thaw water thinning along the lower stones. But inside the room, another change had become quietly permanent. Ethan no longer kept his own tools between her cloth and the window. He moved them instead to the side chest and left the center boards clear, speaking only once while adjusting the shelf edge with his thumb. He said the next orders would need the lower space more than folded parcels ever had. It was not a promise spoken like one, yet Clara heard what remained beneath it, because the returned quilt now stayed where every coming season would be measured. By noon, the second buyer arrived with thread colors for another order, and the quilt above the table remained untouched, visible but no longer carrying refusal. What had returned publicly now stayed where work had already begun, planning beyond spring, and neither of them looked toward the road as if waiting for it to leave again. What do you think hurt more in this story? The quilt being returned publicly, or the reason Clara already understood before opening it? If you stayed with Clara and Ethan through this road, there are more quiet frontier stories waiting here, where small moments change entire lives. So subscribe to Native American Tales for more frontier stories of love, dignity, and sacrifice.